Valley Center is a quiet suburb of Wichita, Kansas. But on November 15, 2013, at 7:17 p.m., the usual silence was shattered by the sirens of emergency service vehicles rushing to help a couple who had been attacked right in their driveway. It was their son who called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they were met by a teenager waiting near his parents' car. He introduced himself as Chris Blaml. Inside the vehicle, his parents, Roger and Melissa Blaml, were fighting for their lives. Both had been shot in the head. Melissa was hit behind her right ear and Roger below his right eye. Based on the trajectory of the shots, the shooter had approached the victims from the passenger side. The injured couple was immediately rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save them. Melissa's condition was extremely critical. Roger's brain had suffered slightly less damage, but he was placed into a medically induced coma. The police searched the house and the surrounding area to ensure the killer had fled. After that, they questioned Chris about what he knew. The 16-year-old teenager said he was a wrestler and had been at a team meeting at school. He arrived home around 9 p.m. and parked his car behind his parents' vehicle. Chris saw his parents inside but didn't think much of it. Since his father loved to joke around, he assumed they were either playing a prank on him or just talking. At the time, he was also on the phone with his girlfriend. After 15-20 minutes, Chris ended the call and walked over to his parents' car. Only then did he realize something was wrong. They were covered in blood and making gurgling sounds, completely unresponsive. He immediately called 911. During the emergency call, and even now, Chris showed no emotion, as if what had happened wasn't real or didn't involve his parents. Detectives noted that this was unusual for a 16-year-old boy, but they didn't dwell on it. Officers took Chris to the station, while forensic investigators began processing the crime scene. Under the basketball hoop in the driveway, investigators found a set of keys and a phone. The keys belonged to the car, and the phone was Roger's. However, Melissa's purse and phone were missing. Since the couple was found inside their car parked in front of the house, with the headlights still on and the doors open, it was clear that they had been attacked the moment they arrived home and tried to get out of the vehicle. Forensic experts discovered 25 caliber shell casings, one lying on the ground near the passenger side and another on the dashboard. After finishing their examination of the driveway, investigators entered the house to search for additional evidence. They immediately noticed signs of a break-in. Someone had forced open the door leading from the garage into the house. Drawers and cabinets had been ransacked. At first glance, all the evidence suggested that a burglar had broken into the home, but the couple arrived earlier than expected, and the intruder killed them. However, despite how convincing this scenario seemed, it left detectives puzzled. In Kansas, the death penalty is a possible sentence for the cold-blooded murder of two people. Why would a burglar, who likely only wanted to steal valuables, shoot the couple before they even got out of their car? He had plenty of time and opportunity to flee. Even if he had come face-to-face with them, detectives began to suspect that the burglary had been staged and started digging into everything they could learn about the couple and their lives. Roger and Melissa met many years ago, and the moment Roger saw Melissa, he told his friend that she was the woman he would marry. He wasn't wrong. Both had successful careers. Roger sold heavy machinery, while Melissa was a vice president at a bank. They were known for being kind and cheerful. Roger always had a funny story or a joke ready, and Melissa was deeply loved by her friends and colleagues for her warm and caring nature. Their marriage was filled with love, trust, and support. The only sorrow in their lives was their inability to have children. But instead of letting it divide them, they made a decision to adopt. Through an adoption agency, they found two little boys, Anthony and Christopher, biological brothers. Melissa often shared with her friends how the boys' early years had been a nightmare. Their biological mother was a drug user, and their father and the mother's boyfriends often mistreated them. For a time, the boys were even homeless, and their mother couldn't provide the life they deserved. Wanting to give them a better future, Melissa and Roger chose to adopt them, offering the boys a loving home and a fresh start in life. The process of adopting siblings is never easy, but in 2001, the Blaml family welcomed two sons, 6-year-old Tony and 4-year-old Chris. Since the adoption happened later in their childhood, the boys, especially the older one, fully understood what was happening. However, they adjusted well. Roger and Melissa devoted time, attention, and effort to their children, and the boys thrived. They excelled in school, traveled frequently, and were active in sports. Both took up wrestling, with Tony even placing second in a regional tournament. They were an ordinary American family, and they were happy. After finishing their work at the crime scene, investigators were finally able to speak with witnesses, starting with Chris. His behavior puzzled detectives. He showed no emotion at all. However, they considered that he might be in shock. Additionally, having experienced trauma at the age of 4, he could have developed a defense mechanism, emotionally shutting down as if the events weren't happening to him. Regardless, the teen was already waiting at the station. Officers read him his rights. Chris confirmed that he understood everything, and then he refused to speak without a lawyer. Once again, detectives found his decision strange and wondered why he didn't want to cooperate. However, in reality, this was the best advice anyone guilty or innocent could receive, and by itself, it was not evidence of wrongdoing. However, the fact that investigators could no longer question Chris didn't mean they couldn't verify his alibi based on what he had already said. He claimed he had been at a wrestling team meeting at school with other students. This was true. He arrived at 6:30 p.m. and left around 9 p.m. He also stated that he drove home while talking to his girlfriend on the phone and called 911 at 9:17 p.m. Phone records confirmed this, as did his girlfriend. Detectives understood that it was virtually impossible to shoot his parents while casually chatting on the phone. Such an act would require superhuman abilities. So they had no doubt that Chris was not the shooter. But could they completely rule him out as a suspect? The answer to this question could have been tried to obtain from other relatives of Roger and Melissa. However, Melissa's brother confidently stated that the only person who had problems with the couple was their older son Roger and Melissa's son, Tony Blaml. The first years after the adoption went perfectly, the boy adapted wonderfully. But by the time he reached adolescence, his behavior changed drastically. In high school, he got involved with drugs and joined a bad company. Roger and Melissa tried to reason with their son, convincing him that such behavior would lead to no good, but the talks led to nothing. In June 2013, he was arrested on charges of assault. The following month, he was charged with driving under the influence. Tony had dreamed of serving in the U.S. Air Force, but after 2 arrests, these dreams were at risk. But he didn't change. The teenager didn't recognize authority, didn't want to listen to anyone, and since he practiced wrestling, he didn't hesitate to use the skills he had learned, and he was much stronger than his father, or especially his mother. Melissa began to openly fear her son. The parents didn't know what to expect from him. At the same time, their younger son lived at home with whom they had no problems, and as parents, they felt they had to protect him from the bad influence of his brother. Therefore, in the summer of 2013, they made a very difficult decision and asked their son to move out of the house. He left the state for a while, but recently returned to the city and settled in a motel. And on the very evening of the attack on Roger and Melissa, he asked his parents to have dinner with him and also to bring him some things that were still at home. Melissa admitted to her friends at work that she didn't know what to expect from her son and was nervous, but she and her husband agreed to go to dinner. Naturally, after learning such interesting details, the detectives wanted to know how the dinner went and if the parents had argued with their son again. But before they found Tony, he appeared at the hospital to inquire about his parents' condition. He said that he was at the motel when his relatives and friends started calling him, informing him that his parents had been shot. The young man was open and willing to speak with the police, but he couldn't provide any important information. The dinner with his parents went normally. They didn't argue, and they dropped him off at the motel around 8 p.m. They went home and he went to his room, and that was all he could tell. The restaurant confirmed that the couple had met with their son, and the surveillance cameras at the motel showed that Tony returned to his room around 8 in the evening and did not leave again. It seemed that the only person who had conflicts with the victims couldn't have been the shooter, unless someone else did it for him. The next day, tragic news came. Melissa passed away, and now this case was officially classified as a murder. The officers interviewed the neighbors of the family in the Valley Center suburb, hoping that someone had seen or heard something unusual. One of the neighbors hadn't seen anything personally, but suggested that a video camera had been installed on his house. The officers reviewed the video and saw a car that drove by and stopped just past the family's house. The car's lights turned off, but after a while, 2 beams of light appeared in the dark, leading to the family's house. It was clear that these were flashlights. Quite a bit of time passed before the couple arrived, and just a few minutes later, another car quickly drove away. This video provided the detectives with a lot of new information. First, they now knew the exact time of the attack on Melissa and Roger, 8:15 p.m. Secondly, they knew that there were 2 individuals involved. They also confirmed that Chris arrived at the house much later, and he was nowhere near the house when his parents were attacked. Now the detectives could answer the questions that had been before them. This couldn't have been a random robbery. Someone was specifically targeting the husband and wife. Whoever the killer was, those 2 had arrived long before the couple, and they had enough time for the robbery. This meant they had planned everything and were waiting for the Blamls to appear, but their identities and motives remained unknown. Therefore, the police had no leads. Fortunately, there is always someone who knows something. A young man approached the police, claiming that he might have information about the murder. He only identified himself as Dalton. Dalton shared that despite his youth, he had already broken the law by dealing weapons and had even served time in prison. He had no intention of going back there, so he was trying to take control of his life and avoid breaking the law. He no longer dealt in weapons, but a couple of days before the attack on the Blamls, he received a message from his school friend, 18-year-old Braden Smith. Braden wrote that he needed a weapon for work. From the message, Dalton understood that the so-called work was going to be carried out by Braden and Tony's mom. Dalton and Braden were friends with Tony Blaml in school. He wasn't sure if they were referring to that Tony, but the coincidence was disturbing. Dalton, of course, did not find a weapon for Braden. However, he had seen news about the attack on Roger and Melissa and decided to report this information to the police. It could have been a different Tony, but the officers were obligated to investigate rather than rely on assumptions. Thanks to the message, Dalton had Braden's phone number. The police called him, and he agreed to come to the station and answer questions. They asked him about the message and what it meant. The young man tried to act as if he knew nothing, but he wasn't an experienced criminal. As soon as they pressured him, he confessed everything. The Tony mentioned in the message was Tony Blaml. Braden explained that Tony had often argued with his adoptive parents, but the plan to kill them only started to form after the young man was kicked out of the house in August 2013 and went to live with his biological mother, Keisha Shaberg. Many years ago, when Keisha gave up her children, she insisted on open adoption so that she could periodically see her sons. According to some studies, this type of adoption is much more beneficial for the children, especially for children age 6, who can already understand what is happening. However, Keisha's proposal was rejected. About 5-6 years after the adoption, Keisha contacted Roger and Melissa. She insisted on seeing her sons, but the couple refused. Then, in 2012, when Tony was 17 years old, Keisha found him on social media. Tony was happy because he remembered and missed his biological mother. The woman also tried to contact the younger son, Chris, but he did not want to communicate with her. Braden shared that Tony had always wanted to reunite with Keisha. His adoptive mother, Melissa, did not forbid it. She simply said, "This probably wouldn't be the best decision for you, but I can't stop you." After Tony was kicked out of the house, Braden and Tony went to California, where Keisha lived. Tony tried to convince his brother to return to their biological mother as well, but Chris clearly stated that he did not want to be involved in it. So in August 2013, Braden and Tony went to live with Keisha and settled with her 7-year-old daughter, and Keisha's girlfriend. Tony was upset and felt it was unfair that he had been kicked out of the house. Keisha, on the other hand, hated the Blamls because she believed they had turned her sons against her and prevented Chris from seeing her. This wasn't true, as Chris himself didn't want to communicate with her, but Keisha could not be convinced otherwise. However, no one tried to change her mind. Keisha and Tony fueled each other's hatred for Roger and Melissa. Keisha told her son what he wanted to hear, that she was his real mother, she would never have kicked him out, and that they had both become victims of the Blamls. This continued for several weeks while they all lived together in a small one-bedroom apartment. Apart from Keisha's girlfriend, no one in the group worked. They constantly used illegal substances and did nothing else. Eventually, Keisha's girlfriend grew tired of it. Not only was she fully supporting Keisha and her young daughter, but now Keisha had invited her son and his friend to stay as well. Unable to take it any longer, she kicked everyone out. The entire group decided to return to Kansas. None of them had housing, money, or jobs. However, Tony and Braden tried to make money by becoming dealers, but they weren't very successful. They were robbed a couple of times, not to mention the fact that they were smoking their own product, which didn't help their business. Despite these grim prospects, Keisha kept telling her son how much she wanted her family to reunite. Her obviously clouded mind came up with some crazy idea that they could leave and start a new life together, Tony, Braden, and Keisha. In her wildest dreams, Chris was supposed to join them. There was a fleeting thought about how nice it would be if the Blamls disappeared, because then they could make that dream come true and have money. After all, Tony was sure he was in the will and would inherit a large sum of money after his adoptive parents died. Overall, Tony wanted money, while Keisha wanted revenge. What Braden wanted was unclear, and poor Keisha's 7-year-old daughter just wanted to stay with Keisha's girlfriend, Sean Hamilton. But Tony convinced Keisha to bring the child along, telling her that he knew what it was like to live without a mother. The entire group returned to Wichita on November 1st. They all settled in a hotel room together. The accomplices had 2 weeks to plan the crime, It was crucial for them to find a time for the attack when Chris wouldn't be able to interfere and when he would have an alibi. By checking the school schedule, Tony and his mother figured out when Chris would be occupied. Tony then asked his adoptive parents to have dinner with him that very evening. While he distracted Roger and Melissa, Braden and Keisha would stage a robbery at the family home. Then they would wait for the couple to return in order to kill them. The morning of the planned attack, Braden changed his mind about helping his mother and son. However, the accomplices couldn't carry out the attack without him, primarily because Braden had the car. So he decided he needed to find a replacement. He reached out to Andrew Ellington, known to everyone as Drew. The 18-year-old was another friend of Tony and Braden from school. Drew would constantly talk about his dream of becoming a hired killer. When Keisha offered him $1,000 to kill Roger and Melissa, he agreed without hesitation. Most likely, he would have done it for free. On November 15, 2013, Drew and Keisha parked the car a little further from the Blamls' house. They approached the house on foot, lighting their way with flashlights, broke the door leading from the garage into the house, and staged a robbery. Then they hid in the bushes, waiting. It took a long time, but they waited it out. Eventually, the husband and wife arrived, having spent the evening with their son. They were likely in a good mood, happy that their relationship with Tony seemed to be improving, and completely unsuspecting of what was about to happen. Drew entered from the driver's side while Keisha entered from the passenger side. Keisha immediately shot Melissa. Drew, however, hesitated. Boasting about wanting to be a serial killer was far different from actually shooting someone. The hesitation almost gave Roger a chance to react, but he was much more concerned with Melissa's condition. He leaned over her, trying to help and asking how she was, although, of course, Melissa couldn't respond. When Keisha saw that her accomplice wasn't moving quickly enough, she aimed the gun at Roger and shot him. The killers then took Melissa's purse, phone, and a few other items from the car to make the scene look like a robbery before fleeing the scene. Keisha ordered Drew to get rid of the weapon. He found a nearby pond and disposed of all the evidence there. Braden Smith finished his statement and stood up, ready to leave. He truly believed that since he hadn't shot the victims, there was nothing to accuse him of. The detectives explained that he would soon be home. The police arrested him and the other accomplices. All four were charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder, as well as robbery with aggravating circumstances and theft. Drew didn't hide anything and showed them where he had thrown Melissa's purse and the weapon. Divers recovered the items from the pond. With the confessions and evidence in hand, the police turned their attention to Tony. Tony broke down in tears, but his sorrow wasn't for his adoptive parents. He felt sorry for Keisha. He continued to harbor anger toward Roger and Melissa and idealized his biological mother. As the teenagers were confessing one by one, communicating with Keisha turned out to be not so easy. She acted aggressively towards the police and denied everything. The police decided to use Tony as leverage against her. Mother and son were brought into the same interrogation room. Tony started crying. He admitted that he had confessed. His mother simply looked at him with a confused expression. It was as if she was rejecting him again, and this had a strong impact on Tony. He cried, asked for her forgiveness, begged her to say that she still loved him, and lamented that he would never be able to hug his mother again. In December 2013, 5 weeks after the attack, Roger passed away, following his beloved wife. Now the accomplices were facing the death penalty. Keisha continued to insist on her innocence, but was clearly scared of the execution. She made a peculiar deal. She did not admit her guilt, but acknowledged that she could be punished for the crime. She and her son Tony would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Braden pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. Drew was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. It's hard to understand how Keisha could reconcile her desire to reunite with her children while persuading her biological son to commit murder, risking leaving her 7-year-old daughter without a mother and a brother in case of arrest. And that's exactly what happened. This was yet another victim of this inhuman and senseless crime. If Keisha truly wanted to be a mother, she had a daughter who needed her. After the mother's arrest, the girl was taken into foster care. Keisha's girlfriend, Sean Hamilton, promised to fight for the child to have her custody. As for Chris, he was horrified by the murder of his parents and severed all ties with his brother and biological mother. Tony tried to contact him, but Chris sent a message through the detective saying that he did not want to know them. He stated that Tony was no longer his brother. Chris grew up to be a wonderful person. He has a family and children. Roger and Melissa would have certainly loved to be grandparents and spoil their grandchildren. Their son is living the life his parents had always hoped to give him.